10 years of school, 6 years of graduate study, 4 years of specialized research, over 1 year of writing. When I talk about it that way, I feel like it should be longer. I have in my hands the first full draft of my doctoral dissertation, 174 pages from introduction to conclusion. And today I'm going to talk to you about what this thing is actually about and kind of the journey that my research has taken over my academic career to lead me to focus on the content contained within these pages. My name is Carson, I'm a PhD candidate, and if you've watched any of my videos on any platforms before, you've probably heard me give the description of I am writing my doctoral dissertation on hospitality in early modern English literature. I have found a lot of motivation and honestly a lot of, it feels like, community by talking about my writing process online, on YouTube, on TikTok, on Instagram, but mostly my focus has been on just detailing how I structure my writing days and how the progress is going in terms of what's on the page and in terms of how I'm feeling about it. But today I want to focus not on how I write, but on what I am reading and writing about. And so I'm going to go through and answer some of the questions that you all have asked me about my research process, about where my research interests started out as an undergrad and how they changed over the course of what has now been 6 years of graduate study and over 1 year of actual dissertation writing. And in preparing to make this video, I did something that I don't usually like to do, which is that I went back and read papers that I have written as far back as like 8 years ago. And I will share some excerpts from those papers in this video. So in a way, this video is going to be kind of a retrospective of how some of the papers I've written and literary texts I've read over the past decade of academic work have kind of each shifted my research interests in different ways and landed me where I am now. This feels a little bit self-indulgent to make because, you know, it's my research. I care so much about it, but I don't usually have like a captive audience who I can just talk at about my research. But hopefully this is interesting to you. This is based on some of the questions that I have received. And I like to think of when I'm making videos on here, what things might have helped me 4, 6, 10 years ago to get a sense of how the academic process kind of unravels. I know a lot of people who watch my videos are undergraduates or are in the earlier stages of grad school and academic research. So hopefully just me detailing how all of this has unfolded for me might give you a little bit of an idea of how this kind of long-term research writing project can go. So let's get into it. I'm going to start with this question because answering it will let me kind of set the stage for where my research interests were at coming out of undergrad and going into grad school. So this is going to get a little bit autobiographical for a minute. What led me to the decision to pursue a PhD? Reading and writing about my reading for my entire life has been like the one thing that I care most about and feel like I am the best at. But I really only arrived at the decision to do a PhD after testing the water with some other things, thinking through other paths I could take, and still just landing at the idea that the PhD was the right choice for me. As an undergrad, I majored in writing, literature, and publishing at Emerson College, which is a school that focuses on the arts, but really focuses on like professionalization in artistic paths. It was at least like 12 years ago or whenever it was that I started one of only, I think, 2 undergraduate programs in the country that had publishing as a major option. And this was a real like fork in the road moment for me because I was really torn between the more professionally based program at Emerson College and another program at a tiny, tiny little liberal arts university called St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, where I would have been taking courses in French and Greek and learning geometry by way of reading Euclid. And I was really tempted by that small liberal arts program because I really loved the really academic, really intense, dense kinds of reading and theory already. But I really wanted to give things like professional avenues in publishing and writing a chance. And so I went to Emerson, I took courses in copy editing, magazine writing, book and magazine publishing. I did an internship at a literary agency. I was really testing things out. But what I just kept coming back to that I still loved the most out of all of these things was English literature, and especially 17th century English literature. And I took this one course on early modern drama, for which I had to buy this book. This genre of revenge tragedy was so exciting for me, so new. It was so raunchy and weird, and I was just like, I could read these and never get sick of talking about them. And so I did something while enrolled in that class, which was very scary for shy, socially awkward little 19-year-old Carson. And I asked my professor for that class if I could buy her a cup of coffee and sit down with her and really talk about grad school as an option. That professor was a bit eccentric. That coffee meeting did take a weird turn into her telling me that I might be faced with a lot of hard drugs and sexual harassment in grad school, which personally, luckily, I was not. But I left that meeting and that semester of college, and really I left college in general, with this pretty clear idea that I wanted to go to grad school, at least to do a master's and probably to do a PhD. And I also had that clarity of knowing that the subject that I wanted to study in grad school was going to be 17th century English literature, primarily drama, because I loved it so much. I wanted to know more. But I also knew when I graduated college that I did not want to jump right into more school. I didn't want to go to grad school right away. And so I applied for what was at the time kind of my dream job, and I got a job as a baker at a local production bakery. And I did that for about 3 years, and it was incredibly rewarding and fun. I was in a band at the time with my sister and my cousin, and we would play these little open mic nights and small gigs at like local bars. There would be some nights that I would be playing music until midnight, and then at 4 a.m. I would be clocked in making bagels at the bakery. And, I told people I was also prepping for the GRE and researching grad school, and I was doing that a little bit. But mostly I was just enjoying myself and enjoying these two other potential paths for me to go down: music, baking. Did I want to pursue either one of them? Ultimately, no, I didn't. I still just wanted to go to grad school. So I got my shit together. I reached out to professors from undergrad to write recommendations for me, including that professor who I'd taken out for coffee years ago and asked about grad school. I applied to programs, and in my statement of purpose for those applications, I talked about not just wanting to do 17th century English drama, but also wanting to focus my research on food studies. Those years working as a baker had been so meaningful and so fun for me, and I really didn't want to give up working with food in some capacity. And so I saw this as kind of the perfect way to merge these two interests of mine. I dug back through my Google Drive all the way back to 2017, and I found this draft from one of my statements of purpose where I am talking about some of my research interests. And I had been outside of the academic arena for years at this point, and even when I had been an undergrad, I never worked with food studies. So a lot of the information I got for this statement of purpose, I got by just Googling literature, food studies, and scanning some articles and getting some cursory ideas of what that meant so that I could write up a statement about it. I'm pretty sure this is just a draft and not a final version, but I definitely talked about some of these texts in the final version, and I still haven't read some of these. Henry IV, I know I'm a bad early modernist. I've never read the Henry plays. That nature play, never read that. The Way of the World, never read that. But it's okay, the statement of purpose is not a contract. This was just how I was describing where my research interests were at when I was going into grad school. And this is where I was starting out 6 years ago when I started my master's degree. Now we get to this question. What text inspired me to start working with hospitality? The shift in my interest from food studies to hospitality started within my first year of grad school, specifically in my second semester. And the text that brought me to that shift in interest was Paradise Lost. I've talked about this before. I will surely talk about it again at some point. Paradise Lost is one of my favorite pieces of literature that I have ever read. And one of the things that I love about it is how dense and how expansive it is, so that every time I return to it, ever since the first time I read it for high school when I was 17, I feel like I noticed something a little bit new about it. A new passage sticks out to me, a new idea. And in my second semester of grad school, when I was in a Milton seminar, the new thing that popped out to me about Paradise Lost was the idea of Eve as a hostess. And this only stuck out to me because I was interested in food studies. And so I was looking for moments of food and eating in the text other than the big one, the fruit. And what I noticed was this moment where Eve is preparing and serving a meal to her angelic guest, Raphael, who has come to the garden and sat down for a meal with Adam and Eve. I started to do some research intending to poke in further to the idea of preparing a meal in prelapsarian Eden and eating before and after the fall. And what I ended up finding were articles about hospitality. And I just went down this rabbit hole of scholarship about early modern English hospitality, and it was so new and exciting to me, and it felt like it was engaging the idea of food in this way that I had never imagined before. During this same semester, I was in a seminar on early African American print cultures, and I was doing a research project for that course about the first two cookbooks authored by Black women in America. And I was reading these cookbooks, and that inspired me to also start looking for cookbooks published around the same time as Paradise Lost was. And so I was just so deep into this little niche of reading cookbooks written by women. And in both these classes, I was just thinking about domestic labor and food production and women's work, women's writing. And it just was just like my mind was marinating in all this stuff. And this is a little excerpt from that paper I ended up writing about Eve as a hostess. And you can see that I am talking about hospitality largely by way of food. I was really interested in the meal specifically as like a food event and a hospitality event. What's really interesting to me now looking back on this is how I'm talking about manipulation and danger in this, because that is what really ended up emerging for me in the next stage of my research as the focus of my interest. I guess my takeaway or my little piece of advice I would give based on this anecdote looking back at this paper is to encourage you to really lean into research as a discovery and exploration process, to just follow tangents, go down rabbit holes, see what happens, because you never know when just some random thing that you read or idea that you have is going to lead to your dissertation project. So from starting with a focus on food studies at this point, I've already started to think about hospitality. And this brings me to my second year of grad school and to this question: how did I really nail down my dissertation topic? In the fall semester of my second year of grad school, I was fresh off the heels of this really fun research project I had done about hospitality, and I was taking a course on Shakespeare, which was very exciting for me because I had to do all of these dispersal requirements in my first year of taking courses in different time periods and genres. And fall of 2019, I got to just sit down and dig into some 17th century drama, exactly what I wanted to be doing. And in this seminar, we read a lot of Shakespeare plays, but the one that I really narrowed in on and that really illuminated a path towards a dissertation project for me was Macbeth. If you have read Macbeth, you will know instantly what I'm saying when I say that this is a play that is obsessed with hospitality. This is a play that is so deeply about hospitality. And really, this is a play about the dangers of hospitality, how a hospitality context is very treacherous and very vulnerable to bad intentions. King Duncan comes into the Macbeth's home expecting to be entertained as a guest, having trust in this kind of contract of hospitality. And instead what happens is that Lady Macbeth, the very strategic, very devious hostess, recognizes this as an opportunity not to welcome and protect their guest, but, to kill him. This is what I ended up writing my seminar paper for this class about. This is the first paragraph of that paper, and you can see that I'm really focused in on dysfunction, betrayal, violence, hospitality as this thing that is uncomfortable and easily subverted. I started using the phrase sinister hospitality in this paper to try to describe that uneasy feeling of suspicion and danger, and knowing that you have to trust the people you're engaged with in hospitality, but also knowing that there's real danger lurking underneath the surface. And my professor for this seminar on Shakespeare, as we were talking about my paper and my research, she was telling me that this seemed like something that could be turned into a solid dissertation project. And she is now my advisor, helping me through this dissertation project. I was still a little bit hung up on food studies, so the next semester I did an independent study with a professor about bread, and I wrote a 35-page research paper about representations of grain farming and processing in early modern English literature surrounding the Civil War. But even though that was a lot of fun, I kept coming back to hospitality. I was locked in. And so at the close of my second year of grad school, at this point, I was officially finishing my master's degree, and I needed to internally reapply within my program in order to pass on to the PhD stage, as part of which I had to write a statement of purpose describing my research goals. And here is an excerpt from that statement of purpose. Honestly, I think it's a little bit overwritten, not my best work. But again, I think in this piece of writing, you can see the movement in my research ideas. I'm still talking about food, but I'm using food as a path towards hospitality. It's all about hospitality. And that was 4 years ago that I finished my master's degree and passed on to the PhD stage. And so for the past 4 years, I have just been sinking deeper and deeper into this little pit, or this little niche, this little research specialty of dysfunctional hospitality in early modern English literature. So that is the story of how I arrived at this topic for my dissertation. And next I am going to talk about some of the things I read for my dissertation, and specifically what it means to work with the subject of hospitality, and even how I structure my chapters. But first I'll just run through these last couple questions really quickly. So the second part of this question, how much freedom is there in choosing a research topic? I think you can probably tell from the video up to this point, there is a lot of freedom, honestly kind of an overwhelming amount of freedom if you don't already have some kind of idea. At least in my field, in my program, in my experience and the stories that my friends have told me, you can basically focus your dissertation on anything you want, as long as you can prove that there's a substantial enough body of scholarship to build on and literature to examine, and as long as you can find an advisor who is willing to coach you through this project. The world's your oyster. You can write about anything. You could write about oysters. And for this grouping of questions, first of all, in terms of how I deal with anxiety and a sense of being overwhelmed, I don't know, sometimes I don't do it that well. It definitely gets on top of me sometimes. I talk about that in other videos on YouTube and especially on TikTok. I've been posting on TikTok much longer, so if you go onto my account and into the dissertation writing or academic work playlists, you will see plenty of videos of me narrating my spirals into self-doubt and paralysis of being unable to work because I'm so stressed. At this point, I'm in the habit of taking breaks before I feel like I need them so I can avoid getting burnt out or overwhelmed too much. I vent to my friends. I check in with my advisor to make sure I'm making the kind of progress she expects from me. I put on a movie or an episode of a TV show that I know will make me cry so that I can vent out all my emotions at something that is not my dissertation. I don't have a perfect system by any means, and I'm always looking for more ideas of how to deal with stress and anxiety. So please, if you have any coping mechanisms for dealing with academic stress and a long-term writing project, please share them in the comments so we can all benefit. But this part of the question about how I'm structuring my dissertation, I can talk about, and I'm going to get to that after first talking a little bit about just what specifically the topic of hospitality in early modern English literature leads me to read and write and think about what this topic actually is. The word hospitality feels very universally familiar. I think it's one of those things that we don't really think too deeply about because we assume that we have an understanding of what it means. And of course, in day-to-day life, you do have a functional understanding of what it means. When I say hospitality, you probably think of dinner parties, being a guest at a friend's house. You probably think of hospitality industry, of working in hotels and food service. And that is definitely broadly part of my dissertation, but there are also two different, more specific pieces of this, and that is kind of the historically contingent meaning of hospitality and also like theoretical approaches to hospitality. What I mean by historically contingent is that even though there was an understanding of hospitality in early modern England as something familiar to us now, going to somebody's house for dinner, hospitality industry in its nascent form, in the form of taverns and inns, while that was at play, there were also definitions and practices and just associations with hospitality in the 1500s and 1600s that were specific to that time that are no longer familiar or functional for us today. Hospitality in early modern England had a real social function. You had members of the gentry and nobility living on these larger estates, and those estates were kind of the locus of a lot of small town countryside life. They provided employment and they provided what was called hospitality, which took the form of not just inviting strangers or travelers in who were passing by, but also putting on entertainments during times of festivity or holiday in the country. And it also included providing food, shelter, and even medicine in times of need for the surrounding communities. These households had the responsibility to practice hospitality in a way that the people around them relied on. And there are a couple of really interesting royal proclamations of the later 16th century issued forth by Queen Elizabeth, in which she is talking about the importance of hospitality. And in one of them, she is even admonishing her gentry for going to London in the wintertime to just hang out in the city and have fun when they should be in their country estates dispensing hospitality. And kind of embedded in this social function of hospitality, you have the idea in early modern England of hospitality as a moral standard to which you should aspire, that hospitality is a virtue, and that really it's a specifically English virtue. It's used as a way to distinguish the moral superiority of the English gentleman. But it is an understanding of hospitality as a specifically English virtue to which the current generation of English gentlemen are failing to live up to. You see authors talking about this concern that there was a previous golden age of hospitality in which the English distinguished themselves above all others by performing perfect, charitable, moral hospitality, but that they have fallen from that golden age, and that in the late 1500s, early 1600s, hospitality is not what it once was. So that's the historically contingent understanding of hospitality that is part of what informs my work. And then, like I said, there's also all of this theory and philosophy surrounding hospitality by people like Derrida, Levinas, Kant, Heidegger to a certain extent, because what hospitality is really about at this basic conceptual level is the self coming into contact with the other in this intimate space in which you have to trust each other, not to harm each other. Hospitality requires an outsider, someone who does not belong in the space within which it is occurring. I, for example, cannot provide hospitality to my partner who lives with me. I have some close friends who I don't really consider a guest in my home because they aren't outsiders to my space. They will always have a sense of belonging where I live. And so with hospitality, because what you have is a space within which it occurs, a host who has some sort of belonging or control over that space, and an outsider who is coming into that space, it will probably make sense to you, given those terms, how the concept of hospitality is used in a lot of scholarship to talk about things like immigration. Derrida specifically talks a lot about this version of hospitality in which the state can either invite in the outsider in the form of an immigrant or a refugee, or can reject that guest. These are all the little paths that I've gone down in these 4 years of research on hospitality. All of that historical stuff about the anxiety of having fallen from a previous golden age of hospitality. All of these theoretical concerns about the ethical questions attending how the self interacts with the other under the umbrella term of hospitality. And I take all of these critical perspectives and all of this previously done work on the subject, and I apply that to literary representations of hospitality situations in which people are mean to each other. And the literature I work with is mostly drama, mostly plays, partly just because, like I've talked about, that is what I have been most interested in since I was an undergrad. But also now, the point that I'm at in my work specifically, I find really interesting the idea of hospitality as theatrical and theater as hospitable. I don't just work with drama. I don't just work with Shakespeare, but since Shakespeare is the most widely recognizable of everything I work with, I'm just rapid fire gonna rattle off some instances in which hospitality is happening and people are mean to each other in Shakespeare. Obviously, we have Macbeth. King Duncan enters into the Macbeth's home and then they kill him in his sleep. Timon of Athens. Timon is a very wealthy man who is very generous with his friends, keeps on inviting them over for elaborate dinner parties where he entertains them and gives them gifts, and then because of that, his money runs out. He goes to his guests, asks for their help, and they leave him flat broke. Or something like King Lear, where Lear demands that his daughters perpetually host him and his retinue of 100 knights until finally they get sick of being hostesses to this very expensive, very disruptive group of guests, and so they kick their father out basically into the wilderness. And then also at one point, one of the daughters is a guest in somebody's home and she gouges her host's eyes out. Or The Winter's Tale, where King Leontes becomes obsessed with the hypothetical prospect that his best friend, who has been the guest at his house for 9 months, has been having an affair with and impregnated his wife. Murder, infidelity, unsustainable expense, all of these dysfunctions are just always popping up in representations of hospitality. And that's just in Shakespeare. I also read all kinds of other literary and non-literary early modern texts. On the literary side, we have things like country house poetry, which is a genre in which the poet is usually writing about his patron's house and about how this house is the best house and it is a moral example of a house, and this house is just a site of perpetual pastoral bliss. And the non-literary primary texts I read are things like moral conduct guides or recipe books, royal proclamations, royal progress narratives, which are this fun, very specific genre of these little texts that are written to document the travels of the monarch on their way across the kingdom and all of the different houses that they stay in along the way. And all of these different literary and non-literary texts, all of the scholarship I read about historically contingent definitions of hospitality and literary analyses of hospitality and theories of hospitality, these just all are little pieces in kind of the patchwork that I'm piecing together for my dissertation to give me a fuller view of what I'm talking about when I talk about dysfunctional hospitality in early modern English literature. And now I'll return to this part of the question, which is how I structure the chapters for my dissertation, how all of these 174 pages and 4 years of research are actually organized. When I was preparing to start writing, I toyed around with a lot of different versions of how I could organize this because, again, there is a lot of freedom as long as you can defend your choices. At one point, I was thinking of going chronologically. Chapter 1 is about the 1580s and 90s. Chapter 2 is about the 1600s, etc., etc. Then I thought about each chapter being primarily focused on a specific author. A Shakespeare chapter, a Johnson chapter, a Heywood chapter. At one point, I was thinking about having each chapter primarily focused just on one literary text and then teasing out all different connections based on my reading of that one text. I got all of these ideas partly by going into my library's archives of dissertations and looking at how other people had organized theirs. These all would have been acceptable, valid choices for how to organize my chapters. But the organization that I ended up going with is that each chapter basically focuses on a different early modern English social concern or issue that, when it overlaps with hospitality, brings to light something specific about this larger idea of hospitality as dysfunctional. I have 4 different chapters, and so there are 4 different subtopics that I am digging into. And those topics, in the simplest possible terms, are gender and women's sexuality, political hierarchy, theatricality, and racial difference. So for each chapter, as I'm digging into that specific subtopic, I'm looking at what we can see when that topic is foregrounded in a representation of hospitality. What specific dysfunctions emerge, for example, when we have a hostess instead of a host? How is the structure of hospitality destabilized when you have a more powerful political figure as the guest, meaning that the traditional hierarchy of hospitality in which host has power over guest is inverted, so now guest has power over host? To what extent does that theatrical quality of hospitality mean that hospitality is fundamentally a performance and therefore false? If we are using the framework of hospitality to talk about things like immigration and cross-cultural contact as interactions between a host and guest, how is that affected by and often strained by that outsider being somebody of a different race, especially in the context of emerging early modern ideas about race, racial difference, and racism? And that first chapter about gender and sexuality, and specifically about hostesses, is kind of a longer and more complicated version of the one article that I have published. And if you're still with me, still listening, still interested, you can check out that article. It's linked in my bio. It's a free open source article. And yes, there is a typo in the title. I didn't do it. And that's it. That is the long and rambly story of how my research evolved from being a 20-year-old in an undergraduate seminar to now being an ABD PhD candidate. And really, this research retrospective is a testament to how I think you should follow what gets you interested and what gets you excited in life, I guess, and in research. You know, a decade ago, I was assigned this book on revenge tragedies, and now I have this dissertation, which has a chapter, my 3rd chapter, on theatricality, almost entirely about revenge tragedy. Now, if somehow, even after all of that self-indulgent rambling, you still have questions about my research process and my dissertation, please ask them below. I love talking in comments and in videos about this stuff, and I really hope that you can get something out of it. My favorite part about sharing this whole PhD journey online is being able to talk to people about their experiences and answer questions about mine. I know that when I was first starting off in grad school, I felt like there was so much kind of mystery around academic work, grad school, dissertations. I often felt like everybody else knew what they were doing and I didn't know. So if I can answer any questions you have so that you don't feel like you're just going in blind while everybody else knows what they're doing, please give me those questions. I would love to answer them. And stay tuned, because the journey continues as I try to turn this first draft into something resembling a final draft. Until next time.